Welcome everyone to February the 23rd. We are now almost 3 months into this expansion, and as we get close to the 3rd month anniversary of Dragonflight, we are going to be looking at the raid for today. However, in which capacity are we looking at the raid? We are looking at the raid, for example, how the bosses have been, how difficult they have been they been too difficult, have they been too easy? What about the balancing from Blizzard? Has Blizzard nerfed the bosses too quickly? Have they taken too much time to nerf the bosses instead? Have they been too complicating, too full of mechanics? It's quite annoying to get through them, or were they quite nicely developed? What about the systems around the raid? Systems like the return of the tier sets without making the tier sets as powerful as Sepulchre. How has that worked in this season? What about also the return of the Catalyst in this expansion, as well as what about splitting up by a lot, actually, the item levels in the rewards of the bosses, including adding very rare items with a lower chance to drop, for example. So that is what we are doing today, having a look overall at how this first season, this first raid has been so far. Now, the first thing worth pointing out about this first raid of this expansion is that it only has 8 bosses. This is the first time since about 1.5 expansions ago that we get an 8 boss raid. We went through Sepulchre, Sanctum, Castelnatria, Nyalotha with 10, 11 boss raids even, and now instead we are back to an 8 boss raid like we had in Eternal Palace. Some players like it, some players don't. Some players like to be done more quickly and to not have to go through so many different bosses. Other players like to have this, this humbling feeling, feeling like you had to struggle a lot to defeat Halondros, only to then look up and discover that you still have to go through Anduin and then Lords of Dread and then Rygalon and then the Jailer. To some players that can be very energizing, very exciting to go through many raid bosses. In my case, I am sort of in the middle, I enjoyed small raids, like for example Eternal Palace. I also not enjoyed small raids, like for example Uldir or Emerald Nightmare, talking about first raids of an expansion, for example. But this first raid of an expansion has definitely been better than those other 2 as a starting point for the raid. The other point worth mentioning is this new thing from Blizzard of bringing back end of wing bosses. So splitting the raid with, an entry-level boss, a mid-tier boss, and then the final boss of the wing type of thing. Like, for example, starting with something like Terros into Sennart into Kurog, with Kurog being the big bad boss at the end of the wing, even though he wasn't the big bad boss at the end of the actual raid. That is something they tried as well in Sepulchre to bring back. We also have it now in Vault of the Incarnates. I also think it's a good choice, because again, it gives you a feeling of progression, not just starting from boss number 1 to boss number 10, but also starting from boss number 1 to boss number 4 of the first wing, and then from boss number 5 to boss number 8 of the second wing, right? It fragments the progression to different wings. It makes it look like more exciting in terms of progression. So I am a fan of this wing splitting type of raid placement of bosses. However, you might have less bosses, like 8 for Vault of the Incarnates. You might also split them into wings, like we had in Vault of the Incarnates. But what about the actual bosses themselves? Were they cool? Were they fun to progress? Were they entertaining? If there is one thing I can praise about these bosses, and I say so as a healer, not even being a DPS myself, is that I enjoyed how the different bosses were bringing out the best of different DPS profiles in different fights. Because if you take Terros, for example, it's a continuous single target fight. So who has the best DPS can, show it, can shine on Terros. And then you have something like Sennart. Sennart is single target, but also burst single target, focused single target whenever the ad spawns, because that's going to be the most important part of the fight, basically, to kill that ad as fast as possible, and then later on to kill Xehanort as fast as possible as soon as you enter last phase. So it's a good change. One fight is just normal single target, the other fight is just, burst single target. Something similar can happen with something like Primal Council, where it's continuous, endless 4-target AoE. There is no burst is required there. It's just 5 minutes long, basically, of AoE. Meanwhile, you have the most important part of Dathia, which is burst AoE, because the most important part of the entire fight is your groups going up in the platforms to get rid of those ads, to finish that ad platform phase as quickly as possible. And there, what is prized, what is great, is burst AoE, unlike Primal Council. That is what I have enjoyed about the raid, giving different ways to shine to different types of DPS specs. I think it was quite good of a way to give different specs, a way to be excited about different bosses. To some degree, it was also true about healers, in the sense that you have certain fights where you have continuous damage, continuous ticking damage, like Dathia, for example, or like Xehanort, and then you have other fights where the damage is very bursty. It's happening in very quick succession, and it's very dangerous in short periods, like, for example, Terros, or like, for example, Kurog. So that also allows you to have different ways to heal and different ways to show off certain specs in certain fights. So that was also quite nice. Now, in terms of actual balancing, well, the balancing has been quite fine overall. Most of the problems at the start of this tier were actually due to the checks, most of them being DPS checks happening, in some cases even HPS checks happening, because your group was too undergeared. Terros, of course, was the biggest example at the start of the expansion, being a big DPS check. After you got past Terros, you had the next check, which was Kurog, was the other DPS check. So it was less about nerfing them and more about waiting a bit more to get more gear to get past them. But besides that, not many bosses required that many nerfs. I think, in fact, most of the bosses were quite fair and quite manageable pre-nerf, all of them, except of course the last one we will be talking about, which is Raszageth. Raszageth sort of stands on its own because of the whole fiasco about the pushbacks. This mechanic, in case you haven't even gotten to Raszageth, basically puts the priests in no man's land. It's a type of mechanic which, before this nerf, actually I'm pretty sure even after this nerf, priests still need help. It was a mechanic where basically priests were the only spec and class which could not, no matter how they tried to save themselves, could not stay alive for all of the pushbacks, all of the 5 pushbacks. Even if you had the DPS later on to go from 5 pushbacks to 4 pushbacks, it still wasn't enough. They were still dying. So effectively, you have a boss with a mechanic which automatically kills a certain class if it doesn't get help. In this case, it was the help of an evoker, which would rescue them to safety. That is perhaps one of the few sour spots about balancing of this entire tier. The way Raszageth made it essentially impossible for a certain class to save itself. But as far as the balancing was concerned, I think it was amongst one of the better balanced raids, which required one of the fewer amounts of balancing. So it's a definite improvement as well in terms of balancing the actual raid. Now, as for the rewards inside of the raid, the whole thing about, number one, bringing back tier sets but not being as strong as Sepulcher, and then the other part about splitting the rewards with different item levels as well as adding very rare items with a reduced chance of dropping. So the tier set was fine. I don't think it mattered too much if you cut in half the performance of the tier set. If you make the tier sets, instead of being 20% of your DPS, only 10% of your DPS, it's still a gigantic increase. It's still something that pretty much all of the specs will be gunning for. I don't think that actually ended up impacting too much. I think it was still something that everyone wanted, even if you made them somewhat weaker. Either way, I don't think there is anything wrong with making tier sets powerful. And then the other one about the different item levels, I think it was quite good, especially now that we have Master Looter, or, sort of a Master Looter, so you can still trade those items around. It's still just fine. I think the special items were a cool idea. Remember, the thought process of Blizzard was, once you get a raid on farm, you start not caring about all of the bosses except for the last couple of them, because they are the ones with the coolest gear, with the higher item level gear, so you end up skipping the raid over and over because you just want to kill those bosses. What if, instead, we start giving some of these bosses some of the higher item level drops, so that even on farm they remain relevant? Case in point, defeating Primal Council, one of the early bosses, one of the simpler bosses, except Primal Council now has one of the best, if not the best, overall trinket for all classes, the Whispering Incarnate icon. This is going to still make you want to clear the raid, because even a tiny little early boss like Primal Council can still have very good items dropping. I think overall it's a cool idea, it's a decent idea to keep the raid relevant even once you finish it, once you start clearing and put the raid on farm. I think it's a decent way to keep you engaged in all of the bosses rather than just the last, couple of bosses. One thing we might have a few more issues about talking about gear is, of course, the Catalyst, because the Catalyst came live 6 weeks after the opening of the raid. So, too many players, the Catalyst was released too late. It was too much of a wait to wait 1.5 months before you had the chance to start converting pieces of gear into a tier set. Even after, as we mentioned, the tier set was made weaker than its version from Shadowlands, that weakened tier set was still way strong enough to be very, very wanted by everyone. So having to wait 1.5 months to even start transforming one piece at a time for 4 weeks, so over the course of a month, was still way too long of a wait. On that regard, I do agree. I think that at the very latest 4 weeks should have been the wait time for the Catalyst. At the very earliest, a couple of weeks should have been the wait time for the Catalyst, but definitely not 6 weeks before the Catalyst opened. So that is perhaps something we might see some improvements in the next tier, the next season of this expansion. So if I take it as a whole, the design of the raid, the design of the bosses, the difficulty of the bosses, the extra features of the raid, like the difference in item level from the gear, as well as the extra addition of the Catalyst plus the tier sets, I think overall it is at a solid 8 out of 10, maybe even 8.5 out of 10. What is only left to judge is the player part of the raid, which is the balance of the specs and classes which took part of the raid. This is something we have talked about a bit every time we do our recap, our overview, our weekly overview of the raid. I still think there is a bit too much of a divide between the effectiveness of the melee specs compared to the ranged specs. At the moment, most of the top performers in the raid have been melee DPS. Whether it's a rogue, whether it's a subtlety rogue, or an outlaw rogue, or even at times assassination, and then it might be havoc, it might be enhancement, perhaps it's windwalker, one time it was fury, nowadays it's arms. There has been an excellent 10 out of 10 variety of melee DPS being strong and popular in the raid. Unfortunately, there has been a 5-ish out of 10 of strength and variety of ranged DPS in the raid. Only just now, we see some Shadow Priest and some Devastation Evoker being quite high in the overall rankings just because they have been buffed recently. But for the first couple of months of this season, the situation was quite dire. You were basically going to, if you could, play with like 12 melee DPS. Except you can't, because it's much easier to play with more range DPS. So you had this bizarre situation where you wanted to play with melee DPS because they were stronger, but at the same time you wanted to play with range DPS because they made the fight easier. It has been quite weird to see the range DPS so weaker in general than the melee DPS in the raid. That's been the The only pet peeve in this first season of the expansion as far as balancing goes in the raid. So as I said, if I were thinking about 8.5 out of 10 for this raid as a ranking, I'm gonna cut it back down to 8 out of 10 because of this slight issue when it comes to balancing as far as the DPS are concerned in Vault of the Incarnates. So this overall, this has been the situation in the raid for me in this first season. You are of course free to leave behind in the comments what have been your thoughts about this first raid in this first season of this expansion of Dragonflight. Now, with this out of the way, it's time to leave each other on this Thursday. As usual, we start the goodbyes with the thanks to all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the support to the growth of this channel. You can of course still support in other free ways, liking and commenting down below as well as subscribing to this channel are good ways to trick the YouTube algorithm. Other ways to support are following me on Twitter as well as following me on my stream over at Twitch at these two links. So, with this out of the way, thank you guys for watching, see you guys soon, which is tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's weird, it's still winter, almost in the middle of it, yet it feels like spring already.